Welcome, everyone, to the program brought to you by the Associate Dean Section for Academic Affairs and Research. My name is Mary Garvey Alguero, and I am the outgoing chair of our section. I am the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Faculty Development at Loyola University New Orleans College of Law. And we are honored this year. Our section was chosen Section of the Year. My other board members, Michael Higdon, who will assume the role of chair, who's at University of Tennessee, David Mitchell, who is at the University of Missouri, and Mary Beth Moylan, who is at Pacific McGeorge. And one of the things that we think happened this year is we all lived through this year, and it was somewhat of a crazy year. And I think the four of us thought we really did need to step up. We needed each other, and we needed to build a community across law schools throughout the country because of all of the unusual circumstances that were happening. So we created webinars where we could meet each month to talk about some of the issues, not just issues that associate deans usually face, but the issues that became all the more interesting with the pandemic, all the more interesting with the political and social issues, with recognition of institutional and individual racism, with issues I think that none of us could imagine that made associate deans around the country really need each other. And this session today, I think when it was imagined back in the spring, we did not know that it would be as meaningful today and on such a grander scale than we dreamed up back in the spring. So today, the name of our session is Classroom Climate and Community: How Associate Deans Accommodate and Support Diverse Stakeholders. And with that, I think it provides us with an opportunity to talk about these issues that are pressing on us in society and how we on the front lines with our students and our alums and our universities and our faculty can help to navigate the difficult issues and turn out lawyers who can be good leaders. As many of you did yesterday, some of you may have also been sucked in this morning as we've just been watching events on the television, stunned, wondering how all of these things happened. And then I think that probably all of you in this audience who are leaders in law school as professors or as deans immediately turn to what can we do for our students? How do we use this experience to teach our students? And what is the proper way to discuss some of the issues coming up with our students? And I think we know leading law students and also our law communities is that we need to be empathetic. We need to be very thoughtful. We need to listen, but we also need some courage, especially as we go through and try to tackle topics that are hard enough for people to talk about or to talk with their friends about. And then we have, as the title reveals, we have diverse stakeholders with whom we are interacting often. Now, one of my favorite quotes, and I think it's always been very apropos to leading in a law school, comes from James Quincy Adams. And what he said, and let me see, I'll make sure I find that. If your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, you are a leader. And I think as law school leaders, that's what we do every day. We don't just think we are going to direct how things go. We are trying to teach the leaders of the future, which this year taught us is all the more relevant. Those students who graduate, those alums who look back to us, need that leadership and need some guidance. Another quote that I just think is very apropos, someone said it or wrote it back in April when, the thing that was heating up was the pandemic. And part of that quote is, on the back end of difficulty is opportunity. And I think that's one of the things that we need to embrace as leaders, is that things are difficult right now, but the back end of that is opportunity. It's opportunity for us to try to guide our students, to try to help faculty and our universities to move forward in ways that are positive. So I think, our roles today in our discussion and as we move forward, we can really influence the way that things go forward. And today in our session, we are going to talk about how we welcome and foster diverse opinions and diverse discussions, and I use diverse in the broadest sense possible, on our campuses, and how we know when to step in and when not to step in. The power of words is the theme of the conference this year, and we know as associate deans that what we write, what we say is critical. I know yesterday lots of deans and associate deans and professors were on the phones and on emails trying to figure out how to say exactly the right thing, not to offend, but to get out ahead of things. Today's presenters are 4 associate deans who have been on the front lines this past year as associate deans, trying to navigate through a lot of the issues we've all navigated through. And they've been generous enough to be willing to share with us some of those experiences. I suspect that some of the experiences went very well, and sometimes we do something and it doesn't go so well. And one of the, I think, good attributes of a leader is that we have to be flexible. So we have to recognize if we've gone down a wrong path and take another path. So our plan today is we will hear from each of our panelists for about 10 or 12 minutes, and I will watch the time, but I assume you will too. And then we will have about 40 minutes of question and answers. You'll be able to post your questions in the chat, and I'll monitor those and we'll pose those to our presenters. And then what starts as a second session is something that the Associate Dean section has kind of made part of our tradition, and that is to have small group discussions. So what looks like a second session at 4:30 will be an opportunity for us to go into breakout rooms where our panelists, along with Michael Higdon, our incoming chair of the section, will provide us with opportunities to go to breakout rooms to talk about these issues and then some specific topics. So Michael Higdon will have a breakout room on faculty scholarship. Russell McLean will have a breakout room on bringing speakers to campus and student concerns. Susan Coe will talk about these issues as they relate to curriculum, and Blaine Lassen will talk about these issues as they relate to alumni and donors. So that will be coming up kind of next, and we hope some of you will stick around for it. Now, I'm going to briefly introduce each of our presenters in the order in which we will hear from them. I say briefly because I hope that they will share with you a little bit about their background and the work they've been doing, and perhaps we will arrive at some good ways to do things. We'll learn some ways we shouldn't do things, and we'll all come away from this better prepared to start this semester, which is starting off with a bang, as we know. So we will hear from David Mitchell. David Mitchell is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the University of Missouri School of Law. Then we will hear from Blaine Lassen. Blaine is the Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Loyola University, New Orleans. Then we will hear from Russell McLean. Russell is the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion, among other things, at the University of Maryland, Francis King Carey School of Law. And then we will hear from Susan Coe, who is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Diversity and Inclusion at South Carolina School of Law. So I am very happy that we are all here, but we aren't. I'll turn this over to David.
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate it. Oh, it's good to be with you all virtually. If we can't be together, it's sort of nice to sort of gather, if you will, and sort of share some expertise. I think it's sort of very fitting, and to correct Mary, I'm stepping down as the associate dean as of 7 days ago, so I'm a liberated associate dean, I guess is probably the better word. And I'm thinking about it yesterday, quite honestly, in that context of what does that mean? And so when we were thinking about this topic, I think Mary sort of said it very well. It was about how do we address our unique roles as associate deans. And so I want to sort of talk about how we get here. So in your email inboxes yesterday, this morning, you received a message from our executive director, Judy Ureen, referencing the reprehensible actions that took place yesterday as Congress convened to carry out its constitutional duty. In her message, yesterday brought an unprecedented and appalling assault on the rule of law and on our democratic tradition of peaceful transitions of power. What began as a gathering of Congress to carry out their constitutional duty of accepting the certified results of the 2020 presidential election was interrupted by something most of us thought we would never see here. A mob stormed the Capitol with the support and encouragement of the president himself. At least one person was shot and killed during the violence. As difficult as it is to do anything at such a dark moment, it seems best for us to continue the discussions planned for the remaining days of this annual meeting, if only because we must not ever be deterred by mob action. And I encourage everyone to devote some of our time together to discussing how we in legal education can assist the nation in recovering from this and recommit it to the goal of equal justice for all. Yesterday was an object lesson in the struggles and challenges of being an associate dean in this particular time. As our representatives came together to try to certify these elections, the halls of Congress were overrun by thugs, hooligans, rioters, and insurrectionists. They were not protesters. And so this is our object lesson. Who knew that we would have this national spectacle of such grave importance to serve as a prime example of how we as associate deans, in our unique role, must navigate these various constituencies and stakeholders. So in the hours during and after the events yesterday, I'm sure each of us struggled to craft an email statement about the events that took place. For some, your deans may have crafted this statement and potentially sought your input. For others, the obligation may have rested solely with you, while still others, neither you nor your dean or your school felt compelled to issue any kind of statement and have been kind of frozen in time. Regardless of which group you're in, your students, faculty, and staff and alumni are watching and waiting to hear what you have to say or to take note of your silence. Your actions or lack thereof have far-reaching implications and consequences for as you seek to serve your school. Your email or words are not restricted to your community. What we write is not captured or restricted to where we live. Of course, it is part of the public domain. Yesterday's events, however, are both simple and complex. The simple is the rule of law. It is easy for us to retreat to the safe harbor and the antiseptic space that the rule of law is to be supported. It's clean, it's neat, it's easy. As law professors in law schools, we teach about it, we write about it, we train our students in this doctrine. The complex, however, underlies the events of yesterday. For example, the law enforcement response to this mob compared to the protests for killing of Black and brown citizens, the lack of tear gas, rubber bullets, militarized vehicles was readily apparent, as well as the lack of arrests. The initial references to this rioting group as protesters and the unwillingness to address the fomenting of the conduct of the president by the president. And while these are complex, it becomes even more so. As the resistance to the certification of a dozen or more Republicans who have called into question and enabled the conspiracy theories and lies about a stolen election, especially when one of the senators calling into question the election, fomenting the insurrection with a raised fist picture, was a former colleague on your faculty, as Senator Josh Hawley is a former colleague of mine, it becomes even more complex. Yesterday, as surreal as it was, however, was an aberration. At least we would like to hope and believe that it was an aberration. When we penned this panel, this session several months ago, it was to address, quite honestly, how do we, in our roles as associate deans, deal with the consistent societal issues that are raised throughout the nation. For the last 5 years, we have struggled with the challenge of how do we address racial inequity, anti-racist curriculum to create, and dealing with issues of police violence against Black and brown bodies in our schools, while still supporting free speech, enabling students and empowering them to speak their mind without being offensive. And how do we strike that balance? As associate deans, we sit in a very unique place. We are not the CEOs of our institutions. We are not our deans, right? We do not represent the entire faculty. And before we became associate deans, many of us had our own identities, our own scholarship identities. I, for example, write in the criminal justice reform area. I write about collateral consequences of sentencing, the disproportionality of the criminal justice system with respect to race and its impact. I'm an African-American male, one of 2 on our faculty, the only one who is tenured on our faculty, one of 3 men of color on our faculty with no women of color on our faculty. I sit at a very odd and interesting place, which means there's often a very burden, which means there's often an expectation to have a comment or a statement. When I assumed the role under a dean who had a short time left, who was only going to be there for 4 more months, an interim dean and a new dean, the first woman to serve as the dean of our law school, the first actually non-white male to serve, right? The first non-male to serve in that capacity. And so what does that say? What does that mean for us as associate deans? And how do we address a student body, a faculty, a staff, an alumni who need to hear or want strong leadership or want to hear from us? How do we do so in a calculated way that allows us to respect the differences of our student bodies, of our faculties, of our staff, and to recognize the fact that our alumni are watching and so are others? As a member of a public institution, of course, not only are those stakeholders watching, but so are the citizens of Missouri and the legislature. And so it means, how do we sort of engage in this? How do we deal with these difficult statements? And more importantly, once you do make a statement, once you sit and arbiter and discuss and engage with the crafting of a correct email, the right language to use, how forceful to be, what to say. And then, of course, the issue becomes, how do you respond? Do you have the support of your dean? Do you have the support of your institution? Do you have the support of your faculty? Should you be out there by yourself making statements, or should this be a group statement? Should this be a collective statement? Once, however, you begin in that role, which I did 5 years ago, making a statement when I first became the associate dean following a summer of unrest and difficulties, then it becomes an expectation. Students and faculty expect you to make that statement. And actually what it does, it actually allows the institution off the hook, because now it's up to one person who now carries the burden and one person who can be thrown under the bus. It becomes that individual. And we recognize the fact that where we sit, right? We sit as administrators. We no longer have this sort of wonderful invisibility cloak of academic freedom as just a member of the faculty, right? Because now we are part of that amorphous administration. Right? We are that group. We are those individuals now. We speak not for ourselves, but for a larger body. And yet, for many of us who feel the need, who have to speak, who need to say something, it's incredibly difficult to be silent. As an African-American male, sitting silent is not a possibility. It's not an option. And so I've taken a number of different tacks as to how I will do this, or how I do this. So initially, I would send out an email to the entire sort of school or student body with respect to the incident that happened, and address them in the most neutral manner as possible, talking about not only about the incidents, talking about the impact, but more importantly, focusing on how they have impacted our students, our faculty, and our staff, and what are the sort of mental health resources that we can offer to assist. Lately, however, as I've been in the job now for 5 years and sort of walking out of it, now it's become far more personal in the statements that I make. The last statement that I made was about my children, right? Recognizing the impact as the father of 2 biracial children, one biracial son who's now become a teenager, and the fear and concerns I have for him. And so the issue is about balancing what we need to do in terms of making these statements, recognizing the fact that they will be watched, they will be heard, but also recognizing the fact that people need us to lead. And it's not an easy place to sort of sit. So the first thing is, yes, making a statement. How do we craft a statement? To whom do we craft a statement? And recognizing, of course, the audiences that we sort of seek to impact. I'm sure there'll be other questions I'll ask, but I will sort of leave it at that and to say that there are no easy answers in this for associate deans. People often look to us to be the problem solvers. Yesterday's events have happened, and quite honestly, I will say that I have been sort of stunned into a place of paralysis, of not knowing what the right tenor is to strike. Now, yesterday's events, however, are somewhat easy in the sense that no one is going to support the overrunning of the Capitol. But yet when I hear lawmakers who are proclaiming that there are others on the other side of the aisle, or Antifa or others who were part of the protest, you sort of say, where's the reality here, right? And so as associate deans, our pull is, how do we navigate that space? So.
Thank you, David. And next we have Dean Blaine Lassen.
Well, thank you, Mary, and hello, everyone. It's really good to be here to be able to share my experiences so far as Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Loyola New Orleans College of Law. My position, unlike my fellow panelists, is a new position, and it was created literally a couple of months ago. And it arose as a result of many of the most recent events of the last year, and particularly those events in the spring, where we saw, massive social protests in the streets, on the heels of these police killings, most notably that of George Floyd. And so those events prompted some significant concerns amongst our students and our faculty. There was a real sense of urgency. And so this position was part of a broad and comprehensive initiative by our administration to address those concerns. And at Loyola, we immediately engaged all of the stakeholders at the law school, alumni, students, current students and prospective students, faculty and staff, and we decided to jump all in and really develop a series of approaches and practices and structures to allay these concerns, because they were palpable and they were significant. So we immediately engaged in comprehensive discussions with each of these respective stakeholders. And so this position was part of that initiative. And when I was first asked to assume this role of being the inaugural dean, associate dean of diversity, equity, and inclusion, frankly, I balked. I was hesitant about it. One reason was because of the sheer enormity of the task in light of this historical moment that we're in. And I thought that, boy, this is the worst time in the world to do this job. Because of how fractured we are around issues of race. But then I also considered that it is the best opportunity to develop structural and substantive solutions to the racial dynamics that we're experiencing as legal educators. So I attempted to get up to speed because I teach trial practice and torts and civil procedure. It's a world away from administration and administration in this realm. So I had to get up to speed, and I started diving into the research on critical race theory and learning what DEI deans, associate deans actually did. What was their mission? What was the job description? What were the expectations? And in going through the research, I was actually buoyed and reassured by the wealth of information offering concrete strategies, policies, practices, solutions, veritable how to address these issues in a law school environment. And at the same time, I began to wonder, with all of this available information, why are law schools still struggling with these issues? Why have we not seen marginal success, incremental signs of progress? Why are racial views so entrenched? Why was all of this practical guidance not being implemented on a broader scale? And why are we more reactive rather than proactive in addressing a phenomenon that has so profound an impact on our core mission as legal educators? So these are the questions that were swirling around in my mind. So, whatever we have been doing to address race and equity and inclusion on law school campuses hasn't reached the root causes of the racial issues that we're facing. And so I think the reason why it hasn't, or why we haven't effectively addressed it, is because we tend to respond to it in an ad hoc fashion, as if these were transient events that will eventually subside. And so the solutions tend to be superficial, tend to be, they're well-meaning and they're well-intended, but they don't really get to the heart of the problem. And recent events, and when I say recent events, I'm talking about the events of the last basically 12 months. They started a few years ago, but they culminated in a cascade of racialized moments that brought it all home for all of us. And so these events, I think, compel a different response than what we've been doing in the past. And the events I'm talking about, just a few of them, the racial justice protest, of course, in the wake of those unjustified killings that were happening almost on a weekly basis, not only by police, but by white citizens attacking innocent Black men and women, resulting in their murder. The caustic, racialized politics that embrace and legitimize white supremacists and white extremists, the systematic disenfranchisement of Black voters, and then on top of all of that, a pandemic which further exposed the long-standing racial inequities with fatal clarity and consequence. And all of these things were happening concurrently. So the racial and diversity, equity, and inclusion issues that we have been dealing with before these events are no longer veiled by the ambiguities of implicit bias or unconscious racism and microaggressions. It is much different now. Racial inequity and racism is now explicit, it's conscious, it's intentional, and it's at our front door. And as legal educators, I think we can ill afford to ignore it or to kick the can down the road or to fashion these ad hoc, ineffective responses. This time it's different, and it has given rise to unparalleled tension. And going forward, we're going to have to teach and administrate and govern amidst this heightened tension. So we'll have to figure out a way to do that. So, whatever this job being that of Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion looked like as recently as a year ago, looks a lot different today. Because we are at this seminal moment. It is a flashpoint. And yet, as catalytic as the moment is, it is just yet another marker on the historical continuum of a racial culture in this country that goes back to the country's origins and to the slave trade. So this is another marker along the way on that continuum. So when we view it in that historical context, this seminal moment is really not unlike the one that the United States was experiencing during the Civil Rights Movement. It sure feels like the 60s for people of color. And for those like me who are old enough to remember that time and who lived through it. I grew up in the segregated Deep South. So it is deja vu all over again with some of the things that we see today. The same trepidation I felt as a 10-year-old listening to the more nuanced racial political rhetoric of a Barry Goldwater. I feel the same sense of dread when I hear the less thinly veiled, more in-your-face racialized politics of today. So it feels very much the same. And I think, in thinking through this, how should we reshape our approaches? Maybe we should ask ourselves, what would we do differently today to foster racial equity and a better sense of inclusion on a law school campus if we were somehow magically transported back to the 1960s, but with the benefit of knowing how the ensuing 60 years or ensuing decades would unfold, knowing that the Civil Rights Act would be enacted, knowing that progressive reforms would have followed, knowing that our societies would be more racially diverse, knowing that we'd have election of the first Black president of the United States, and then knowing that after all of that, we would regress so precipitously back to the pre-civil rights movement in terms of racial tensions and a fractured, racially divided society. So what if we had the benefit of that and we could do our jobs as legal educators with that kind of sort of revisionist intent? What would our hiring practices look like, knowing what we know now? How would we recruit and admit students? Would we teach differently? Would our curriculum look different? How would we govern ourselves? How would we allocate resources? If we had the benefit of that hindsight. And so looking at it through that kind of lens, I think, brings the necessary sense of urgency that we need to bring to this task. And I think it clarifies also, on the positive side, the enormous opportunity that this moment in history actually provides to us to get it right, or at least to start real reform that's going to make our law school spaces better places for us to educate. So in terms of remedies, I think there are two foundational goals that we can all, I think, benefit from. and trying to achieve, and they're symbiotic. They bear a symbiotic relationship to each other. One is just structural diversity, right? There is value in actually creating a sufficient critical mass of culturally diverse participants in the law school environment. Now, critical mass alone, as we know, it's not going to magically change things. It's not going to, poof, we have a more diverse, number of people on campus. Therefore, all of these, racialized moments will just dissipate and magically go away. That's not going to happen. But you do need a sufficient critical mass for these conversations to result in solutions. So that's the first thing. You need structural diversity, and you also need what Professor, I think Anastasia Bowles, I want to give due attribution to her and her beautifully written article on cultural proficiency, how to develop cultural proficiency in law schools. It's a Charleston Law Review 2017 article. I encourage you to take a look at it. But so cultural proficiency, and that is basically skills and values and policies and practices that are necessary to interact effectively in a diverse environment. So I think you need both. You need structural diversity and cultural proficiency. Now, cultural proficiency is the heavy lift. Faculty are going to have to be trained to provide culturally competent instruction in the classroom and to integrate culturally competent lawyering skills into the curriculum, right? And I'm not talking about the sort of warmed over, risk-averse diversity training that university administrators, through advice of general counsel, foist upon us at the beginning of each academic year. In some ways, I think that kind of pablum is counterproductive and may actually exacerbate and compound the resistance within the law school environment. And there's some resistance to confronting these issues because race is such an inherently discomforting topic. And it's a function of our human nature. It's not casting aspersions or attributing fault here, but it's hard for us all to really talk about it, in a direct way. So, amidst these elevated tensions, it's going to be, even more challenging to develop this cultural competency or cultural proficiency that I'm referencing. Many faculty, understandably, feel ill-equipped to manage or discuss racial dynamics once they on campus. Some faculty don't see racial issues as even impacting legal education. Some faculty, and again, these are understandable human reactions. Some faculty may reject responsibility for even creating solutions, and some faculty just don't want to even have a discussion. So those are the challenges in developing cultural proficiency. But without cultural proficiency, we're not going to really make much progress.
Well, thank you. Dean Listen, we're going to move on, but I hope that in our question and answer, we will pick up on this idea of what that training looks like and how it works effectively. I'm going to turn it over to Russell McLean now.
Hi, everybody. It's good to see you all. Or actually, I can't see any of you, so it's good to see the panelists, but I assume that there are actually people in the audience listening. I am Russell McLean. I use he, him pronouns. I am in my 5th year of being the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion at the Maryland Carey Law School. As I start, I want to at least acknowledge my positionality in this world. I'm an African-American man. I'm extremely privileged, having grown up middle class with parents who both had college degrees. And I've had a pretty good life. And so I think what that means for me is that it's important for me to acknowledge my own privilege as I enter these spaces, that I'm not, I don't get a pass, right, to just be, by the nature of my existence, be an expert on these topics. I think today's main idea, is to share with you some lessons that we've learned. And I want to just share something that I learned very recently, that when you're doing an online presentation, you should not eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich right before you go on. I like to tell jokes. I fashioned myself a stand-up, well, not really a stand-up comedian, but like a closet stand-up comedian, which means I neither write nor perform jokes. But the good news is I can't see you, so I'm just going to assume that you're all laughing and think that I'm hilarious as I think about myself. So I want to talk to you a little bit about creating an atmosphere where people feel like they belong, where they feel like they can really get involved in tougher, more difficult conversations, where we can interact with each other in spaces where we may even disagree. We want to create these atmospheres, but we understand that we have different experiences and different points of view on our journey to wokeness. And so on the one hand, you have people who are injured and raw. This is no more evident than it has been this year with the experiences that others have mentioned with murders of African Americans by police and private citizens. This stands, not in isolation, right, but on it stands on a foundation of a lifetime for many of those who are from marginalized backgrounds of insults and harms, big and small. And so, each new injury is not only, in and of itself harmful, but it is also a thing that is, constantly reopening wounds and preventing them from healing. On the other hand, you have people who are uncomfortable. They may be allies. They may disagree with us. But all of them, I think, are perhaps a little bit afraid, right, to say the wrong thing. They want to participate in conversations, and they see themselves, I think, as we see ourselves, as good and reasonable people. If we're liberal, we desperately want to bring conservatives into the room because they are the ones who really need to be present at these meetings about implicit bias or microaggressions or white privilege. Often, if you do this work, you feel like you're preaching to the choir, I think sometimes. If we're conservative, we're probably tired of being called racist, xenophobic, or sexist, among other things, and we may feel silenced in this so-called cancel culture. So you have, I think, on two sides of the spectrum, those who are tired of always having to educate others and point out these problems, and those who are tired of being blamed all the time. So anyway, I'd like to offer my suggestions on how to have tough conversations. I don't love the term safe spaces because safe to me indicates an absence of risk. And I think, frankly, to have meaningful conversations about race and gender identity, sexuality, and many other aspects of identity, that these kinds of conversations can be really risky. And I think we have to acknowledge that. So I want to suggest some characteristics for creating an environment that both acknowledges and ameliorates that risk and allows for having real conversations. So I have an acronym because I'm a law professor and that's what we do. So instead of SAFE, I'm going to offer you the acronym HAVEN, H-A-V-E-N. My H is for humility. And humility to me really indicates and appreciates the fact that we are not perfect, right? As educated, as woke maybe as we are, that we all have flaws, and we would be well served to enter these conversations not viewing ourselves as perfect, right? First taking an inward look, right? Not throwing stones from glass houses, I suppose. My A is for authenticity. And I might add in here transparency, but the idea here is really to encourage people to come to these conversations and be willing to be themselves, right? To be open about what they're thinking, to ask the tough questions, to be willing to expose their thinking or their uncertainty as they enter into these spaces. I don't think you can have meaningful interactions on these topics, right? You're just lecturing, right? If you're talking about things and people can't ask questions that they really want to know, right? Like, why is it wrong for me to say this, right? Or what, why does somebody get offended when I do that, right? Or why must I include this kind of messaging or this kind of information in my teaching? That we're just lecturing at them unless people can kind of ask these questions and contend with tougher issues. And so to really encourage people to be themselves, to be authentic in those spaces that you create. My V is for vulnerability. And vulnerability to me is the piece that really acknowledges the risk, right? If we're going to ask other people to come to these conversations and to be themselves, to be willing to say the things that are on their mind, to openly ask questions, to seek guidance, that we risk getting hurt by what people might say, right? We risk getting injured by the perspectives that others might share, the questions that they might ask, those wounds that we've entered these conversations with, we risk having those exposed. Or if we're on a different side, we risk yet again, being, accused of being blameworthy in some way. So vulnerability just, asks for participants in these conversations to be willing to take that risk and to be aware that it exists. My E is for empathy. And empathy is really the understanding that anyone who comes to these kinds of conversations, we all see the world through different lenses. We've had different life experiences. None of us is like the other in all ways. And so it's important to have and to take opportunities in these moments to see the world through the eyes of others. Just understanding that the way that I see the world isn't the only way to see it, right? And that reasonable and good and well-meaning people can see the world differently. And being open to hearing those perspectives and actually listening to them. And so I was 4 letters into a really good acronym. And so I needed an N at the end. And so my N, which I actually think is a good one, but my N is non-judgment. Maybe non-judgmentalism, I'm not sure. But really, this is kind of the other side of the humility coin, right? That in the same way that we don't expect ourselves to be perfect and that we can acknowledge that our own room and opportunity for growth, that we can not expect perfection of others either, right? Often the kinds of conversations that we have on these really tough topics can sometimes end up with, finger pointing and blaming. I've done a lot of, talks about implicit bias, that, or privilege, where you're kind of pointing out someone's bias or pointing out someone's privilege. And I wonder if we could maybe do slightly less blaming, right? Which doesn't mean we don't point out flaws, but slightly less judgment, that perhaps we might see slightly less defensiveness and maybe more of an openness to having these kinds of conversations. So those are just some thoughts on how to have what can be, I think, difficult conversations. I want to offer you one additional thought before I stop. I started with humility, and I think that it's really important just to enter conversations and interactions like these, not expecting and ourselves to be perfect. I think those of us who teach in law, I don't know if it's all educators, but I think it's certainly law educators. We know our subject matter well, right? We've taught the courses that we teach for years, and we're locked in on our substance. And I think for us, it can be really tough, right, to try to be the final word on things, right? To, as David mentioned, to be drafting, right, the statement by the dean or other university administrator, or as Blaine said, you find yourself having to kind of go and do all the research to figure out so that you don't make, the big mistake. And so I just want to offer this, that we shouldn't expect perfection from ourselves, and that we should be willing ourselves, as we engage in this kind of work, be willing to take risks. I want to offer a book to all of you that I think every educator should have on their shelves. It's a book called Mindset by Carol Dweck, D-W-E-C-K. So Carol Dweck talks about two kinds of mindsets. One is called a fixed mindset. The other is called a growth mindset. A fixed mindset really views capacity and ability as fixed, right? You either are good at something or you're not, right? You can do something or you're not. You have facility with a particular kind of thing. You're apt to do it or you're not. A growth mindset, on the other hand, recognizes that although you may not be great at something, you can learn to do it, and you can become great with the right kind of effort and guidance and environment. And so I would encourage everybody who wants to get involved into doing the hard work that we're talking about today, to have a growth mindset about yourselves, right? To really be willing to try things out and be okay with it if it's not perfect, right? Be willing to make mistakes and learn from them. Be willing to listen to students who criticize what you've done, right? And to not be defensive about it, and to acknowledge, you know what, I see your point, and that's a really good lesson for me to learn. And I think that if we can model some of those kinds of characteristics in our institutions, that perhaps it could be contagious, and that we might actually find that it has a really positive effect on our environments. And with that, I will stop and say thank you.
Thank you, Russell. And Susan?
So thanks to the section and Michael for inviting me to contribute to this discussion, and thanks to Mary for moderating, and my fellow panelists for joining me. I noticed in listening to the presentations, which were all excellent, and I learned a lot, thank you very much, that my experiences in my administrative roles jive with David's and Blaine's and Russell's. But my presentation actually really dovetails with Russell's. So kind of following on Russell's heels, I'll shortly introduce, but then talk a little bit more about accommodating and supporting diverse stakeholders. I arrived at my current position as Academic Affairs Dean after serving 4.5 years as my school's inaugural Diversity and Inclusion Dean. And I spent the last 6 months juggling both roles. And during my short term as the Academic Affairs Dean, I benefited tremendously from my experience as the Diversity and Inclusion Dean. In particular, serving in the latter role has trained me to stay attuned to the differing perspectives that exist between students, faculty, and staff, as well as the differing perspectives embraced among students, faculty, and staff. But truly, what's helped me most in both roles has been my experience as a teacher. When you run a classroom, you gain administrative experience, if on a smaller scale. So the advice I would offer today in this setting is much the same as what I would advise faculty members to do in their classrooms. And I think I can boil my thoughts down to a single do and don't. The do is do create an institutional culture. Right? Just as effective teaching requires establishing a classroom culture, for example, setting classroom norms and expectations, effective associate deaning requires establishing an institutional or organizational culture. And I think we all know this, but if we don't consciously set out to create an institutional culture, we may not actually do it. So create a culture, an institutional environment that fits your vision, right, of what you want to accomplish in your role and what you want your students and faculty and staff colleagues, your stakeholders, to experience as members of your school community. And to do that, you need to tell everyone what it is that you envision, and you need to act accordingly. And the place to start is with your dean. You need to work within the parameters that you're given in terms of your authority and the priorities of your dean. So although I won't dwell on it here, and the first and most important convert, right, to the culture you want to create at your law school is your boss, right? Or put more diplomatically, developing the culture will start with a dialogue between you, the dean, and perhaps other associate deans as well. You also need to think about the culture as you find it at the law school and in your local community, perhaps even your state. Right? Some places will be more resistant to diversity and inclusion measures than others, and you need to be aware of that. At an institution like mine, the University of South Carolina, I've learned that incremental trust building steps are important, and that moving too quickly can cause unnecessary dissension and can make it harder to achieve and sustain an inclusive, diverse culture. So what kind of culture should you create? There's no single answer to the question. For me, this means establishing an institutional environment that creates psychological safety, not safe spaces. I concur with Russell, right, that safe spaces aren't necessarily conducive to growth and learning, but psychological safety that creates an environment that encourages interaction and dialogue, especially among diverse stakeholders, and even when discussing potentially contentious issues. And the concept of psychological safety was first developed in the organizational science literature over 50 years ago. And since then, empirical research has demonstrated that psychological safety is an important component of a successful workplace because it's what allows employees to feel safe at work, so as to be able to grow, learn, contribute, and perform effectively. So effective leaders create psychological safety for their teams. And although this concept has been primarily studied in the context of the work environment, psychological safety is an essential condition more generally for successful group collaboration. As such, the concept has obvious application to the law school classroom as well as the law school community more broadly. Now, more specifically, psychological safety is integral to fostering the willingness of students, faculty, and staff to take interpersonal risks and invest their energies into engaging in dialogue. And this is especially important when discussing sensitive or polarizing topics, which can make anyone feel unsettled, vulnerable, or even targeted. And as leaders of our institutions, we should work to instill a sense of psychological safety. So what is psychological safety? I'll start by explaining what it isn't. It's not about being polite. It's not about being conflict averse. It's not about being comfy. It's not about coddling. Psychological safety refers to an individual's perception of the consequences of taking an interpersonal risk. The risk of, for example, being seen as ignorant, right, or incompetent, or negative, or disruptive. Right? And putting this in an educational context, it's the belief that the law school environment is safe for risk-taking. So in a law school environment with high psychological safety, students, faculty, and staff feel safe to take risks around their classmates and around their colleagues more broadly. They feel confident that no one will embarrass them or, very importantly, punish them for asking a question, for making a mistake, or sharing an idea. And we all protect our images carefully, especially in this social media age where everyone has a camera phone. And many schools are taping all class sessions. So for this reason, when we fear looking stupid, we don't ask questions. Right? When we fear looking incompetent, we don't seek feedback. Right? When we are worried about being seen as negative or toxic or arrogant or rude, we won't be critical. We won't voice our doubts. If we're worried about being seen as disruptive or just annoying, we won't exhibit curiosity. We won't suggest anything too thought-provoking or anything too innovative. But when community members feel psychologically safe, they will engage with each other, because in a psychologically safe environment, you're given the benefit of the doubt by your colleagues, meaning that others will assume good faith on your part with respect to what you do, and you will do the same for them. So why is psychological safety an essential condition for effective group collaboration and learning? Research very clearly shows that in groups with psychological safety, members share more information with each other. They engage in moderate risk-taking. They learn from group experiences more readily. They demonstrate greater creativity in problem solving. They experience greater trust and respect from other group members, and I think very important to our roles, they show greater organizational and institutional engagement. So how can we foster psychological safety, which in turn will facilitate discussions about contentious issues and provide the haven, right, that Russell is speaking of? Well, I mean, Russell has it exactly right. I completely agree. There are a couple of behaviors we can engage in as institutional leaders that will foster psychological safety in our schools. Number one, right, establish shared expectations and meaning. Right? In the context of diversity and inclusion efforts, I found it helpful to provide definitions of those concepts. In particular, I emphasize that diversity means a wide range of issues, not just race, not just gender identity, not just language, right? Home language. Inclusion is about everyone, and I mean everyone. And setting that tone can help bring all stakeholders into the dialogue. Framing is very important. Frame your role as the person whose job it is to help the institution achieve your shared educational and institutional goals. As an associate dean, you have the opportunity, you have the authority and responsibility to make certain decisions, and you ought to be as transparent as you can about what it is you're hoping to achieve, where you're seeking input, why you're seeking it, how you will use it to come to a decision. If you won't act without majority approval, say so. If you're not constrained by a need for consensus, make that clear from the outset. Emphasize what's at stake in any given situation. For example, in the classroom, I constantly emphasize that asking questions or sharing thoughts is a low-stakes way to contribute and learn. And the only thing at stake, the only thing on the line is pride. As an associate dean, I take much the same view when I'm soliciting input. People don't need to have fully fleshed out proposals to spark ideas. For example, our institution is seeking to develop revenue generating programs consistent with our mission. And I know we're not alone in that, although I think we may be a little late to the game. And we've sought ideas from faculty and staff as widely as possible. Some proposals are more inventive than others, although using the law school courtyard as a wedding venue really isn't a bad idea. But the low stakes have been helpful, right, in generating broad participation. And this serves a further useful purpose, which is that everyone has been heard. Everyone's had a chance to contribute ideas so that whatever direction we choose will not be perceived as administrative fiat done without faculty, without staff, without community input and consent. In the past, frankly, we've struggled in this regard. Previous administrators have established a top-down approach. And for example, one time brought in a whole team of outside advisors for a new initiative without consulting even the members of the faculty who write in that area. Whatever revenue-generating possibilities there may have been were limited by a lack of faculty interest, and opportunities for synergies with research were lost. Behavior 2. Create a culture of participation that welcomes all voices. Be inclusive, be accessible, approachable, invite input, emphasize inquiry over advocacy. And in particular, and this definitely resonates with what Russell was speaking of, don't let your fear of making mistakes or discomfort in addressing a topic lead you to stop others from addressing an important topic or stop yourself from discussing that topic. One way to encourage others to take risks is by demonstrating it in your own leadership. And if you're worried about making a mistake, you can fix them. Right? You can fix your own mistakes. You can fix the mistakes of others. Plus, if you avoid discussing an obvious but touchy issue, like what's going on in the world right now, your colleagues will notice. And your discomfort will become their discomfort. They may wonder why you're ignoring the obvious. Maybe you don't care. Maybe you think it's not properly a subject of concern for lawyers or law schools. And this will impact your institutional dynamics and may limit what your stakeholders believe to be within the compass of discussion. When I was the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion, one of the best things I did was create a student task force to assist me with my work. The task force was a place for inclusive discussion, and the students took ownership of the work of inclusion at the law school. They created a leadership structure. They created a constitution. The leadership structure included not only the officers, but representatives from every student affinity organization based on identity. And the founders included representatives from American Constitution Society, our BALSA, our Carolina Equality Alliance, our Christian Legal Society, FEDSOC, Veterans and Service Members in the Law, Women in the Law, our Student Bar Association. It was more recently joined by newly formed groups, including our Jewish Law Students organization, our Latinx Law Students Association. We also have a Law Students of Color collaboration. And this group has helped me enormously, especially since I have had little to no budget and no administrative resources to assist me in the D&I context. But also very important, they gave me buy-in and community participation, right, in all the endeavors that I undertook. I made sure I had their consensus, and we only operated by consensus within. And we were able to accomplish a lot within the law school. So do create an institutional culture. And, once you establish it, you've got to reaffirm it through your words and actions. But as narrative logic requires, a do should be paired with a contrasting don't. So while I advise you to consciously create an institutional culture, I also want to warn you about the consequences of not creating an institutional culture. Specifically, don't forget that nature abhors a vacuum. If you neglect to convey what your institutional expectations are, you will leave your stakeholders in limbo and not help them achieve to the best of their respective abilities. And worse, you leave the door wide open for someone else to create an institutional culture for you. And this culture will almost certainly not be of your choosing or to your liking. And from the standpoint of diversity and inclusion, one serious drawback of the vacuum is that the people who will rush to fill it will largely not reflect the diversity of the institution. Right? Some people know how to ask for what they want, and some people have a sense of entitlement to push, regardless of whether there's a set of procedures or a transparent set of criteria. If those things are not established or communicated, some folks will still ask, but others won't. Thus, creating an institutional culture is vital, not only for what it can achieve, but for what it can forestall. At my institution, this is something of a work in progress. As I grow into my new role, I'm trying to create clear criteria where they don't already exist. I'm trying to make sure that deviations from rules or policies are not just the privilege of the few that know how to ask for them, but are made available to all. And if not possible to be shared widely, then as a matter of Kantian ethics and the categorical imperative, should not be dispensed under the table. I don't mean to suggest that flexibility isn't appropriate, but this is an area where I find that creating a culture of transparency is particularly beneficial. And finally, I want to speak to the notion that handling diverse stakeholders requires some special skill set beyond the ken of most professors or people more generally. Anyone can create a law school environment that fosters learning and achievement for all of your stakeholders. Effective leadership does not require adherence to any particular leadership style or technique. And I think what sometimes gets in our way is our preoccupation with ourselves. And I don't mean to imply that we're full of ourselves. I think the opposite is true. I think that most of us are self-conscious and concerned, if not outright worried, about our leadership. Right? In particular, When working with diverse stakeholders, we can become very anxious. We worry that we won't say enough about an important but sensitive issue. We worry that we'll say too much. We worry that we'll offend individuals. We'll worry that we'll insult entire cultures. But this preoccupation can become a stumbling block because it impedes our ability to connect with our stakeholders. So remember, horror vacui. To avoid that fate, make sure you create an institutional culture that is itself inclusive and that can help you achieve your further goals. Once established, the culture can perpetuate itself. But if you step into the associate dean role at an institution without such a culture in place, you may need to work hard to make things more transparent and to encourage everyone to participate and to feel invested in the values of the institution. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers. And we have some questions that have been popping up. And one comes from one of the questions there. And also, I have this question. We definitely, as leaders, need to have courage, and we definitely need to be willing to take risks. But in this time where everything is so politicized, how do you create the haven, and how do you create those institutional expectations? It is very risky. And I think, you said you need to create the atmosphere where someone doesn't feel like they will be punished. But we see in the news, we see at our institutions where people are punished for saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing. Even if they say they have good intentions, people say, well, that's code for you really did mean to be racist, but you are hiding behind your good intentions. And so how do we do this? I feel like everything is so sensitive right now. And that's for any of our panelists.
So my own thing, I don't think there's a right answer to the question. I mean, I think that we all approach these things differently. And so my first reaction really is to say there may be, for any one of us on this panel and for anybody who's listening, there may be that many different kinds of ways to kind of address those kinds of issues. I am not one who, I tend to believe the best, I guess, just that's kind of who I am as a person. I just tend to think that people are well-intentioned. I don't think that most people, I'm sure there are some, but I don't think that most people that I'm encountering in my work as an associate dean kind of view themselves as racist or sexist or some other kind of ist, right? Or phobe. And so I from that, then I feel like I can approach conversations with them without calling them that, right? Without even viewing their characterization of something they've done as well-intentioned, kind of my interpreting that in a different way as code for something else. I do think that people are, in a non-pejorative way, people are ignorant, right? Sometimes, right? They just don't know what they don't know. They don't know that something's offensive, right? Or they've been socialized in a way where something is just a normal way of interacting. And it is not until sometimes they're in our spaces and someone like us or someone, in our buildings, is willing to point those things out. And maybe this is the first time that's happened for them. And so for me, it's important for us to recognize that they're on a journey too. And we may or may not win them over, right? Like we may or may not convince them that they should be like us. And I don't even know if that's a good goal. I just think that it's important to maybe just be a little more gentle, a little more open, a little more forgiving, which probably allows them some space to listen as well and to learn.
Okay, and go ahead.
I was going to chime in. While I agree much with what Russell said, what I think is concerning is, so in 2016, after the election, right, students wrote to me because I had been writing emails about the issues around race. And they said quite poignantly, explicitly, we were expecting an email from you because many of us in marginalized groups are feeling under threat. And we want the administration to recognize what this reality is. And so I agree that there are a lot of people who are on different stages of the journey of their continuum, and yet there are those who are further along, those who are in minority numbers in our buildings who constantly feel under threat, both internally and externally. And when we talk about providing a space that actually accommodates all of our students, it's a balance between how do we handle with kid gloves to those who may be ignorant, and how do we protect the mental trauma and physical space of those who feel consistently under threat. I mean, I have said to my students repeatedly over the 15 years when we've had major incidents that I said, when I walk out of this building, law professor is not printed on my forehead. I'm a Black man in America, which means it comes with all of that baggage of being Black in America. And so the statements that we make in the building have to reflect that what we may do for kid gloves may be seen as being a non-administrative response when it's viewed through the lens of those who constantly are feeling the issues of being part of the educating, having to educate others, the constantly being traumatized, and that's the concern, right? Is that it's creating a statement or engaging in a way that respects both of those places on the continuum and actually serves both students well.
Go ahead.
I would just pop in to add that working, for example, with my student task force has really helped me bridge a lot of those gaps. And because the students in their constitution, they cannot take an action without full consensus from all the board, which is made up of all the members of those very different perspectives. So they've actually issued a number of statements over the past several months responding to the killings of George Floyd and others, and not just this past spring, but before, responding to concerns of racism at the university, responding to concerns of political targeting amongst their own constituency within the student body. And it took a while, right? Many hours of running the statements through until they found something that they were satisfied with. And then, of course, I had to wash that through my dean, who had to wash that through administrating the university to make sure it was all okay. But they got pretty good at making sure that they were able to convey their thoughts without sparking, anger from those who might disagree, because the statements are very strong, but inclusive. And I'll add here, a few years ago, I was speaking in a group about teaching difficult subjects in class. And so I just asked some of my students to tell me what they thought about how we should address within our own classrooms these issues. And one of my favorite responses is this one. It's an excerpt from a student describing the discomfort within the class about issues and why some topics should be addressed head on. So this is what they wrote. Many students seem to only conceive of racism, for example, as interpersonal, purposeful, and overt. So discussing it in the context of a case feels like an indictment, as well as a distraction from the legal concept. Thus, people get defensive about these issues and tend to treat them as off-topic, outside of a, for example, constitutional law course. But I think the collective disdain for comments invoking identity or justice is outsized and reflects a deeper discomfort with the subject beyond its taking up class time. And I think we use this as a defense mechanism to avoid engaging with the consequences of the law and the power we wield over people's lives in ways that are harmful. I fear this limits our ability to think critically about the law and engage with the consequences of our future practice. So I think the solution to this falls in the hands of professors. The greatest way to lend credence to the relevance of these issues is to include them in class discussion, even just in passing, in the same way one discusses any other legal concept. The best way to dispel the notion that talking about identity, for example, or injustice in the law is off topic is just to make it a topic. So, David's exactly right. Our students are looking at us as administrators and faculty members to lead the conversation. Even if we stumble, they're waiting for us to open that door to have that conversation.
Okay, we have a question in the chat. How can we effectively execute the non-judgmental prong of Haven in the classroom with respect to positions that are simply wrong? For example, a student denying that white privilege exists and even intimates that white men are under attack in today's world.
So, I talk about privilege a lot, and so what I tend to do when talking about privilege is not approach it as white privilege. There's a really great resource if anybody is interested. If you just Google axes of privilege and oppression, there are a number of different kind of diagrams, but it's basically spokes on a wheel, and they have all of these different kind of identity spokes. And on one side is the privileged side, on the other is the oppressed side. And I will often use that with students to talk about privilege and talk about my first time looking at it, right? Like David, I'm a black man in the United States of America, right? The first time I ever did this, somebody gave me the exercise. I'm like, why do I even have to bother doing it? I'm a black man in the United States. I am, by definition, oppressed. And I started to go through this chart, and I saw, okay, yes, I'm black, but I'm a man, which is a privileged characteristic. I'm heterosexual, right? I'm cisgender. I'm middle class. I'm well educated. I speak English as a first language. I'm really good looking. Like, I have a lot of privileged characteristics, right? Like, super good looking. Like, you know what I mean? Like, so I'm actually on most axes, most of my identity characteristics, I'm a really, really privileged person. And so I think that the part of the reason that there is such a strong reaction to the notion of white privilege is that sometimes it's just addressed kind of in isolation without kind of acknowledge of other characteristics. And so to the extent that, I would tend to broach the topic that way and maybe have students think about privilege more broadly than just on the race axis, because we are all made up of, intersections of many different identities.
100%. I love this because, one of my favorite training exercises that I've done, particularly not just with student groups, but with law firms in the area, has been a version of the identity signs activity, and where you ask questions and people move to the identity signs that answer those questions or fill in those statements for their own selves and their own life experiences. But I have many signs up, including, education, gender identity, socioeconomic status, and even religion, for example. And, and some of those questions that I ask pertain to privilege. Where do you feel discriminated against? When do you feel that you're privileged? And I point out that everybody has a place to stand, right, in response to all of those questions. And what's always amazing to me is when debriefing with a law firm in particular, people start speaking out and say, I had no idea I was part of this diversity and inclusion discussion. I thought it was about them, but I'm part of this too. And it starts the conversation. It's exactly, for me, what Russell pointed out. When people don't feel like they are being blamed for something, but rather they're being recognized as part of this conversation, and that they share traits with others and have different traits from others and different experiences, they can begin to talk.
Okay, Russell, I will tell you that in the chat, which I know you are not able to see right now, but you got a GQ handsome comment.
Oh, thank you. Yes. Thank you so much. That is very validating. I appreciate it.
It said 4 privilege points for super good looking. So you must have fans out there in the audience. Okay, another question. When thinking about inclusivity across the curriculum, do you confront tensions with academic freedom, and how do you manage that?
So yes, yes, you confront tensions with academic freedom. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest, quite honestly, one of the biggest pushbacks, particularly if you're dealing with an associate dean having to deal with a faculty member and class and curriculum and students involved, right? How do you address that? I mean, I think over the past year, we've seen the biggest one has come up with a professor who wants to consistently use the N-word in class, saying our students will encounter this word in their practice and therefore we have to use it and we're coddling them if we don't. Right. I mean, that's huge. Right. And yet I also think, that law schools are a training ground, and that assaulting the psyche of an individual on a daily basis is not something that we need to do. right? There are ways to sort of convey that point, to talk about fighting words, to engage in those conversations without having to traumatize and particularly re-traumatize when you talk about a small group of students in a space. Right now, that means having a conversation. That means having a conversation with the dean to support. That means having a conversation and looking at the campus policies, right? And that might be a larger issue of faculty governance, faculty council, faculty, the dean, and so forth. But yeah, it's clearly one of those in which you're going to have students who are consistently going to be beating down your door as the associate dean, saying, or going very public with it, saying, so and so is consistently engaging in this kind of rhetoric in class, and how do you sort of manage that, right? And it means, and this is where I think this is where maybe Russell's axis comes in very well, right? That you have a certain privilege in front of the room and power as the professor to do that and to not do that, quite honestly. And that's not infringing upon your academic freedom or your power. That's you taking care of your students, right? And I think it's framing it in a way that says this is not about what you feel is a duty to educate. It's about a duty to protect and train and deal with your students in that class, right? I mean, I consistently hear from criminal law professors who talk about their unwillingness or their uncomfortability with talking about the concept of rape, right? As talking about that as a crime in classes for that very reason. Right. Well, then why is it so very different then when it comes to words like that we don't feel the same way? Right. And that this is where the disconnect, I think, often lies, because we view this in such a very different manner, as opposed to saying, look across the board at what we do to protect the mental health and wellness of all of our students. And why can't we apply that universally and uniformly?
Go ahead.
I think that's right. I think it can be sometimes tough to convince faculty who are so entrenched in a way of approaching subject matter. I do think that it is helpful sometimes with faculty to talk science and to observe, if you're not familiar with the dynamic called stereotype threat, you should become familiar with it. But those kinds of triggers interfere with cognition and learning. And so if you don't care for moral and kind of other reasons and just doing, kind of avoiding those kinds of things because it's the right thing to do, perhaps faculty should care because it's actually interfering with the mission to which they've committed their whole kind of professional identities, right? It interferes with teaching and learning. And, whether you think you're, helping them in some way by doing that, you're whatever possible, kind of benefit you're offering by helping them develop a thicker skin, you are, exponentially interfering with their education by re-traumatizing them.
I don't know if this is good or bad, but the prevalence of camera phones has definitely impacted my colleagues' willingness to be to anything in class. And I had a situation this past fall, actually, in a discussion in a class about what would the ramifications of Justice Amy Coney Barrett joining the bench and the implications of that court with respect to that professor's area of expertise, that course. And there was a student who recorded, even though it's available more generally, but recorded snippets of the presentation and put it up on social media. Went all over the place. Then I heard from students on behalf of the professor, students furious with the professor, students furious with the student who posted the recordings, as well as concerns about the honor code, right, and using those recordings out of context. And that was a really delicate situation where I spoke with the colleague about the presentation, which wasn't a bad presentation, but frankly, from watching the full presentation, it was 20 minutes of direct delivery nonstop about these are the things that are going to happen. Boom, 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 boom. And having the faculty watch it and think, okay, well, that kind of silenced the discussion in the class. Maybe we can go about it in a different way, right, to get students to have a discussion about what could happen, what might happen based on various political perspectives and past decisions. But it was tough because that is the faculty's prerogative, right, and how they want to structure their class. And the faculty did not use insulting words, right, did not take a bad tone but did deliver just a straight up, this is what's happening. This is what's going to happen. And it really upset other students in the class who said, I can no longer learn from this professor. So it turned out okay. we ended up making it work out. We spoke with a lot of students, and everyone seemed to come to a good place with it. But it took up a good couple of weeks, and there was much hand-wringing in my office, at least.
Blaine?
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, David said it so very well, but I wanted to just add to that it's very important to have those conversations. Of course, depending upon the extent of the transgression in the classroom. But, I've found in my brief time that confronting the situation and speaking with the student or students who feel, in some way violated by what was said in the classroom, and then speaking with the professor and explaining the reaction of the students, and even bringing the two together to explain their relative position. Now, in some cases, the transgression is so great, you won't have that opportunity. But the point is to confront the conflict and try to manage that racial dynamic as it occurs. I mean, conflict, especially in a learning environment like a law school, doesn't have to be negative, and indeed, can present sometimes the best opportunities to move to a better place and to develop the kind of understanding and the cultural competence that I've been talking about, and it enables people an opportunity to grow. Now, the risk is, you might at times be met with, well, you're infringing on my academic freedom, and I'm not going to do anything any differently. But if you don't try, you're never going to get to the root of the problem, and you're going to continuously have these kinds of episodes. So I find it enormous value in confronting that kind of conflict, and that presents the best opportunity for growth. And again, in my very, very brief experience with these things.
Well, and that makes me think of something Susan said, and that is, it is setting up your expectations not only among your faculty, but in your classroom. So if there are expectations in your classroom that you will tackle hard issues and that you're going to learn from conflict, then perhaps people won't be so threatened by the conflict. Where if it's just like you described, the one faculty member said, this is how it is, and that's it, then conflict probably becomes a much greater deal and a damaging deal than a means of discussion or a point for discussion. We have another question, and that is, how do you enlist other constituencies in your mission? We've talked a little bit about faculty. We've talked a little bit about students. What about alums or the greater university? Anybody want to comment on that?
I mean, I'll always talk, Mary. You know that. So you guys need to step up. What's up with that? I think it's incredibly important to bring them in. So one, if your campus has an inclusion, diversity, and equity office or folks who engage in that work routinely, right? We don't have one. We don't have a person in our law school. We're not as highfalutin as Maryland, or South Carolina. We just don't have those bucks apparently. We can't have our own. So we got to rely on campus people, right? So we bring the campus folks in. Well, we do have a diversity and climate committee that is made up of faculty, staff, and students. What I often think gets lost in this conversation is the importance of building climate and community with staff. All right, that we talk about. Faculty, engage with students in the classrooms as mentors and advisors, and staff are the frontline people, both for prospective students and for students who are present and for alumni when they come in the building, right? And so it's incredibly important to get them to address their issues, right? So one of the things that I did for us was about visual representation. When I became the associate dean, we had a staff board downstairs where we had the photos of faculty and staff up. But our custodial staff, who work in our building exclusively, but they sort of work with the Central University, they didn't have their images up on the board, and these are predominantly people of color. And so it was incredibly important that we took this invisible labor and we made it visible people, and we put them up there and to recognize as a part of the community, right? And so that's sort of framing those things, and some of these things are sort of low-hanging fruit, right, as to how do you create an environment and community. And with respect to alumni, it's the same thing. It's making sure that when your career services folks, they bring in a panel that is diverse across a whole number of spectrums, right? That it's not just one area of diversity, right? And the same thing when we talk about admissions, bringing in different groups. This is Discover program or McNair Scholars, or being very intentional, right? I mean, the buzzword, of course, is intentionality. Well, to me, that's not. To me, it's kind of bizarre that we have to actually tell ourselves to be intentional when it just makes good sense, right? The idea that you're saying be intentional to be as proactive and expansive and inclusive as possible is good business, right? And why would you not do that? And so, to me, it's an easy. Those are easy things, and yet I recognize that we struggle with it because folks are very adamant. And for me, I think the issue becomes alumni who've been out for a long period of time, and they see changes that they may be very uncomfortable with, right? So we went to the gender neutral bathrooms, right? When you change things that may impact space and place, and you have alumni who come back, those are often the ones where I think the greatest struggle occurs. But it means framing the conversation and the narrative in a way to talk about the evolution of the law, right? Put it in the language of the law and how we address and how we learn and what are we preparing our students for? And that, I think, helps create the larger conversation around that.
Yeah, with respect to alumni, that's one of the, I think, richest sources of that we can enlist in this effort. What we did, and I credit our dean with this, is she immediately reached out to our alumni. So how do we engage them? You call them, you say, we need your help. Our students are hurting. What guidance can you provide? How can you help us in this effort in light of everything that's going on? So, we happen to have a very prolific alumni who is actively engaged in civic and political endeavors. Many of our federal and state judges are alumni of the law school. So when the dean called them, they were ready to respond. And one of the things we did was form a committee. We called it the We Work for Justice Committee, that immediately engaged the students. And the committee consisted of just a cross-cultural mix, predominantly African-American alumni, but from various ages and legal different parts of the legal profession, number of federal judges, state judges, very prolific, well-established attorneys, and they were all in immediately. And that provided us with just an ancillary resource to address these issues. And, they immediately, conducted a number of seminars and webinars where the students were very actively involved and even shaped the subjects of those webinars. And I think it was very effective and well received. So my short answer is, how do you engage alumni? Every law school has a coterie of alumni who would feel the urgency of this moment and would be willing to help. And I just think that this is one of the first stakeholder groups that we can enlist in this effort that would respond in a very effective way.
I'd like to seize the thread that David raised about staff, and it's actually an area that I have not done a great job with, and that has been including staff in my efforts. I've been very focused in my time as the D&I dean on students, but without financial resources, administrative resources, course relief, or research expectation relief, there's only so much you can do within your capacities. But one thing that I have asked for is now that we actually have a faculty diversity, equity, and inclusion committee, the first that we've ever had this fall, I specifically asked that the invitation be issued broadly for staff to be included, as well as students to join in with that mission. And when I have been able to put together activities for faculty, I've been very inclusive of staff as well. Actually, one time staff asked for their own separate presentations on negotiating, and I targeted particularly women and negotiating for your jobs, for whatever you want in life. And the faculty were like, cool, we'll all be in there together. And the staff were like, no, we have different concerns and we don't want to be in a room with all the faculty. And that is when I began learning, this is very early on in my D&I career, that academia is incredibly hierarchical, incredibly so. So making sure that you have an inclusive environment within your school is crucial to your work on the diversity, equity, and inclusion side. Because if anyone who feels excluded, it's going to be staff members, especially amongst faculty who may feel left out many times, but don't always recognize the privilege that we possess compared to our colleagues on the staff side.
One thing that we have not addressed, and we know that there are associate deans who would like to go on to deanships. We know there are junior faculty members who are advised by research and development deans. And does anybody want to comment on either self-censorship of scholarship choices because of things being controversial? Either you encourage people to write in the controversial areas or to stay away from them.
So I'll just jump in. I think it depends. Some of that may depend on the culture of your law school. But I will say for my part, like my advice to anyone would be write what you want to write about and let the chips fall where they may. I mean, follow your passions. I am... Like all of my scholarship is stuff I'm passionate about, and I don't really have the time or energy to kind of spend on other stuff, and so it's either valued or it isn't. And so that's all I've got to offer.
I definitely think it's important, and I'll leave the scholarship. I agree with Russell. Right. I think you need to write what you need to write, and you need to sort of do what you need to do, because there's always going to be an audience for what you want to write on in your scholarship. I think the more pressing question becomes, do you engage in self-censorship if you have a career trajectory and if you want to be a dean or a provost or something, right? And the longevity of one's comments, right? Because we know today that none of our comments stay private. Right? None of our emails are only ours, right? That if we're on Twitter, it's out there, right? If we're on Facebook, it's out there. That if we respond offhandedly, it's out there. If we just hit the like button, it's out there, right? So all of these things are now become your resume, right? And so that's very clear. I think someone once told me a long time ago, they said, you know what, there are going to be places that aren't going to want you as a dean if you are that outspoken, if that's who you are. And then there are going to be places that are going to want that. Right. And so quite honestly, it's about finding the fit for you. And if you are that outspoken and someplace says no, then that's probably not where you want to be a dean or something else. Right. I mean, I think that sort of speaks to the issue, as well as the fact that law schools aren't static. Right. That what may be problematic for a group of faculty at a time when you may say something may change and their personnel may change or what have you, right? And so I think that's sort of one of the things, is that while you can be aware and attuned to that, I think quite honestly engaging in that self-censorship often is problematic for you. My litmus test, even as a junior untenured faculty member, was I need to be able to go to sleep at night. I need to be able to say what I need to say in the meetings and the settings and what I have to say and feel good about myself. Right. And so I think that's what's important. It doesn't mean being offensive. It doesn't mean being rude. It doesn't mean something different. It means if you need to speak on an issue, doing it in a way that is very careful, which is why I think many of us struggle with the crafting of where we wordsmith emails, right? While we sit there and we think about what's the appropriate tone, the language, the usage, how's it going to be perceived? I wrote an email after the 2016 election to which students said he needs to resign. We think it's problematic. He's calling us racists. And nowhere in the email did I say that they were racist. I didn't call anybody out, right? But I said, we're not going to stand for white supremacy. Oh, you're calling us white supremacists. I'm like, no, I'm not calling you that. But the interim dean at the time was like, well, David, I think you're doing it in a backhanded manner, and da-da-da. And so we had to have a conversation about that, right? But I wasn't going to step down unless being asked to do so. But recognizing the fact that what we say is going to be dissected, and people will find fault with it if they want to, right?
Okay, and someone in the chat posted, we should normalize asking why an academic or dean has not taken risks. That's part of the job, is to take risks. One more question, and I'm looking at the little time tick down, so maybe I will just go ahead. I think Hannah has put in the chat what will happen. I think you leave this session and you join the 4:30 session to join one of the breakout rooms. And I will go ahead and just identify those breakout rooms again. Michael Higdon will continue and talk about faculty scholarship. Russell McLean will talk about presenting speakers to the community and student concerns. Susan Coe will talk about curriculum and some of the issues we've talked about. And these are for discussion. So for you to join, and have those discussions. David Mitchell will talk about kind of across the university and university policies. And Blaine Lassen will talk about alumni and donors. And if we end up with just small groups, yes, we may try to join those up. So it looks like we are at the 0. I don't know if we all turn into pumpkins, but I think we all join the other room is what I think we do. So thank you to all our panelists. And we hope that some of you will join us in our breakouts so that we can kind of debrief some of this and hear more from you.